Bruce McDonald is one of Canada's busiest and most respected and probably best known filmmakers. He began his career in the early 1980s and he worked as an editor. He's also very strongly associated with sort of a movement that took place in the early 1980s, which some people have called the Toronto New Wave. It was a time when it looked as though there was going to be a kind of a revolution in Canadian filmmaking, and without a question, the early films of Bruce McDonald indicated that there might be something dramatic about to happen in Canadian filmmaking. It didn't really happen to the extent I think that anybody hoped, but that certainly does nothing to diminish the fact that Bruce McDonald's films were something which Canadian audiences were not accustomed to seeing.
I've never really killed anyone before, but that's what I'm shooting for. That's my ambition.
You have to kill about 20 people now before you're taken seriously, but let's face it, what other options do I have?
Bruce McDonald's first movies, Roadkill and Highway 61, are noteworthy because what they do is they work kind of a groove which is actually very well established in Canadian films, which is the road movie. It helps that, you know, Canada is one of the largest countries in the entire world, so there's lots of road to cover. But what McDonald did was, in working in those first two films also with his writer and star, Don McKellar, who was also somebody who was part of that scene in Toronto in the early mid-1980s, was what he was able to do is to kind of take those elements of the road movie that might have been sort of familiar in terms of Canadian movies, but also to sort of inject a sensibility into it that was in fact very new.
Put your hands at 10 to 2. That's 12:45.
It was kind of satirical. The film sort of played out in this sort of weird limbo between being influenced in some ways by documentary, but also being sort of completely fantastical in another way. They became kind of like Canadian dreams of road movies.
There's two different ways to look at it. Billy just wants the models and limousines, and I'm happy with the hookers and taxi cabs.
Parked Car Logo is probably the most loved and best known of Bruce McDonald's movies. But what's also important, I think, about the film is that Bruce McDonald's affinity for these characters, and they are deeply flawed characters. There is in the movie a very, very strong attachment to the ideal of a man, even though that ideal is constantly being exposed throughout the movie to be a kind of a sham. These guys can't really get together. They can't really go back to the old glory days. The fact is that they're all that much older, and they verge on looking ridiculous often because they're like punks in their 30s. The fact is, it hits on something which is, I think, for a lot of people, very emotionally resonant. The idea that you are trying to relive your past when it felt like the entire world was yours. What's sad about that is that it always bumps up against reality, increasingly the older you get, and the more you tend to hang on to these fantasies, the more difficult they can be to accommodate in your real life. Parked Car Logo touched on all of these things, but in a way that was, I think, you know, interesting in a narrative way, the way that it kind of constantly reverted between being a documentary and being a portrait of these characters. But I think also, in the sense that these guys, their road trip is really an escape from adulthood. And I think that powerfully resonated. And again, it was a circumstance of casting. I think all of the band members are really good, but especially, and this was critical, was the casting of Hugh Dillon and Callum Keith Rennie as the two primary, both antagonists and in a weird kind of way, almost romantically attached. I mean, it's a bromance. It's a punk road bromance is what it is.
The recession hit, kids left, started drinking, wife left, lost the whole deal. Found God, lost God, kept drinking. Now he just waits.
The question that often comes up when you talk about somebody like Bruce McDonald, especially somebody who has worked in as many different contexts, styles, genres, and worked for television and made documentary and made features is, you know, can you work in that many different contexts and still have a kind of a coherent style and approach? And up to a point, I think, with Bruce McDonald, I think there's no question that he does.
My name is Tracy Berkowitz. 15. Just a normal girl who hates herself.
It's a question of sensibility. And I think that the skepticism in his movies that his characters frequently demonstrate in terms of the way they relate to the world around them, and asking us not to see these characters as failures, but just simply as people who are going through life learning lessons that ultimately we all need to learn. There is something in that kind of, I would say, modulated and reasonable approach to getting through your life. There's something very Canadian about that too. Canadian movies don't very comfortably tell you that if you just stick to it, if you just be yourself, then everything will be fine. What McDonald realizes is there is a huge gap between our ideals, the things that we wish for, the things that we wish we were, and the life that we have to live. And I think that element of fantasy anchored on the pavement is something which is very Canadian and which I see in all of Bruce's films.